What's up, folks? Frederick Murphy here again with another episode of History Before Us, and I am in Louisville, Kentucky at the Riverside former plantation site, and I'm here with T. Lee. It is May, close to the end of May, and it has a nice chill on it out here, so that's why you see this toboggan. So it is, and you see the trees, the leaves are all bloomed and flowers everywhere, but it's chilly down here in Kentucky. But we're going to explore this site. We're going to explore the grounds. We're also going to explore the home itself. There's some construction going on, so if you hear a little bit of noise, I do apologize, but I'm here with T. Lee. What's up, T. Lee? How you doing?
Hey, I'm good. How are you today?
Good, good. Excited about this tour. Thank you for actually accepting
Absolutely.
the invite.
Absolutely.
I know it was kind of last minute.
It's okay. We can do things on the fly.
What were the surnames connected to the ownership of this site?
So technically the site is called Riverside, the Farnsley-Moremen Landing.
Okay.
So the house was named after the two people or the two families that occupied it the longest. So Gabriel Farnsley is the man who we believe was responsible for having the house constructed.
Okay.
And then the Moremen family owned the house from 1860 until 1989, when it was sold to Jefferson County.
Okay, so it's part of the city.
It is. It's part of the city. We are one of two historic sites that's owned and operated by Louisville Metro Parks.
Just two?
Yeah, just two.
Wow.
So, it's an interesting model.
Yeah,
but they kind of, we got grandfathered in a little bit when, but yeah, so this was a riverboat landing and ferry crossing and a historic farm and plantation. It was a commercial farming operation that was utilizing the labor and knowledge of enslaved people. So we know of at least 47 people who were enslaved here between 1820 and 1865.
Okay,
So,
we'll get more into that.
Sure.
I always like to look at the landscape and see what people were actually seeing. And as you see right now, of course, there's benches and things like that and tables, but of course we know that wouldn't depict what it looked like back then. So how far did this stretch? How many acres was it?
So originally it was about 200 acres. We have 300 today.
Oh, so you added.
They added. Well, so at the height of the property, during the Moremen family occupation, it actually stretched. It was about 2,000 acres. It was one of the largest 3 farms in Jefferson County.
Wow.
But in the geography and the landscape are really what makes this place significant.
Did you all see there's a river right behind us?
Right there.
Yeah.
But once you leave downtown Louisville, we're about 13 river miles south of downtown. And downtown, you've got this nice, broad, flat valley where you can just stop anywhere. But once you leave downtown and the river kind of makes this westward southern bend, you get this much narrower U-shaped valley with these really steep cliffs, and you just can't get off anywhere. And so that's really what made this place attractive, was there was some geographic feature that allowed people to get up here. So,
okay. And here's our first historical panel.
And this was a project, this is one of the first projects I actually worked on when I started back in 2018. And the goal was really to help people understand more of what this place was. And, you know, it shows that this is a process. This is actually the sign that I would completely rewrite if I could.
Why is that?
Just the language and the perspective on it.
Okay.
I mean, we've updated that. We've learned, right?
Yeah.
It's a continual learning process. And there were just some ways I would reframe it, which is important.
And was this the actual site that this former slave dwelling was on?
So it was right. It would have been right here.
Here.
Pardon our mess. We had a storm come through.
Yeah.
But it would have sat in that site.
Okay. And so Kitty and Richard Moremen were two of the names that I saw in the visitor center, right? Can you tell us about that couple?
So the Moremen family brought 23 enslaved people with them when they moved here from Brandenburg in 1860. And the slave schedule that we had didn't have anybody's name on it. So for a long time, actually Kitty was the only name that we knew because she had been identified on the back of some photographs, some family photographs later on. But through our research, we actually found her husband on the records of the Civil War. He, in his mid-40s, he absconds is the word they use. He leaves here without permission in 1864 to go and join the Union Army because he knows that it'll ensure his freedom.
Sure.
And because of his service, they both applied for a pension after the war, and we were able to get that pension file and not only find Kitty and Richard's children and where she ended up living and even where they're buried, but we were able to find a whole nother family. So we went from having one name to knowing at least half of the names.
That's why those pension records are so important.
So important. Any record is so important. Those fragments are just so significant and significant pieces of the puzzle. And that's really how I describe what we do. I tell people my job's like putting together a 500-piece puzzle, but they only give me about 300 of those pieces, and I don't have the picture on the box, right? But I have to use different sources of evidence, and that's another, I think, significant thing about this property is it's very process focused, and we talk a lot about doing history, and I think that's an important piece to share with the public because a lot of people don't understand how it is that we do what we do. All the bricks used to build the house were actually made here on the property. We found the foundation for the kiln. And we actually found a brick signed by Gabriel Farnsley during the restoration up here in the cornice. But because these bricks are about 10% smaller than the commercially made bricks that they use later on. So we've been looking at bricks and measuring them for a long time, but it wasn't until Joe came that we actually started looking for fingerprints, right? And that's one of the things I tell people, you never know when a new source of evidence
can come about,
can show up, or even just a new perspective, right? And
so, I got to ask, where are the bricks with the fingerprints?
Well, my favorite sets, if you actually start looking in a lot of places, they were actually tooling the mortar with their fingers. But this...
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's clear as day.
And even the kids, like every group of kids notices how small they are.
Wow.
And I was, of course, talking to somebody one day and the light hit just right. And she was like, wait, isn't that a thumbprint? So there's a thumbprint there.
Yep.
And then if you look,
Sure enough, it is.
here is the tip of a finger. You can even see where the fingernail actually clipped it right there.
There's the evidence.
But then when you start looking, the picture I sent you is actually on the other side.
Okay.
Got some on the back porch. And those tangible connections to the past are so significant.
For sure.
But this is the front of the house, and because they called it the Farnsley-Moremen house, we have actually done a split interpretation. So downstairs looks like it would have in the 1840s, upstairs looks like it would have in the 1880s when you actually had 3 generations of the Moremen family living here. There's another barge.
Yeah, I hear it. It's the moneymaker.
It is the moneymaker. But somebody actually lived in this house until 1979. And on the property till 1989, and
it just ended, or just
they actually started renting it.
Okay.
About the last decade, they were renters, and there was a trailer and they didn't actually have trash collection until they started the restoration. So we have lots of evidence that they left behind, but about 80% of the windows are original, all the locks, all the doorknobs. The house got electricity when it was about 100 years old, but it never had running water.
Still doesn't.
Still doesn't. So there was an operating privy on the property till 1979.
Okay.
We've left that one for later excavation.
I know that's right.
So
we're heading in.
Yep. And like I tell the kids, like, I just think of my stairs as a time machine.
Yes. Now, what type of business were the Moremen family?
So they were, so of course the ferry was a commercial farming operation, but this was a provisioning stop. So the way I explain it is like, it's like the last best gas station before you leave town on a long trip. And especially once the steamboat companies were making regular trips, they had to know that there were places they could stop to get what they needed. So, so they would actually have contracts with these farms along the river. And this was also a boarding house. So Farnsley builds this place. His brother has a something similar, about 8 miles north of here, but it's oriented towards the major land route.
Okay.
And so so really he builds this place with the intent of it being a commercial operation.
Okay. So the 47 individuals who were enslaved here, what were, I mean, obviously we know the day-to-day tasks, right? But so I'm thinking like other areas where you would have like a cash crop and those types of things. So what were the responsibilities?
So Kentucky is a little bit different. Kentucky, the only major cash crop here in Kentucky is hemp. Mm-hmm. And so you really don't have the large numbers of enslaved people like you do further south. In fact, you probably have maybe 10 enslavers in the whole state to enslave 100 or more people.
Okay.
Yeah. But at one point, Kentucky has more per capita enslavers than some of the places in the deep south. So it is kind of more, it's ubiquitous. Yeah. And but Kentucky exports about 5,000 more people than they ever import. It becomes a major stop on the interstate slave trade. In fact, Louisville is a major stop. So a lot of mixed production. In fact, but there's a lot of urban. It's an urban environment. Yeah. So you have a lot of urban enslavement, and a lot of people are hired as these highly skilled craftsmen, or hired to the steamboats, working on the waterfront. In fact, we know 2 men. Tom and Dave, who were actually hired out to the steamboats by Farnsley.
Okay.
And so it starts off, this place is established as a farm and a ferry crossing in 1820. And we know that 9 people are enslaved here. In fact, 2 men, Levon and Sam, are used as collateral for the mortgage that secures the property. And the Ebenezer Christopher and his family and those people live here for about 6 years before Mr. Christopher is killed, unfortunately, by one of his son-in-laws.
Oh, wow.
And then that's when Gabriel Farnsley and his business partner purchased the property.
Okay.
And Farnsley enslaves 15 people here. So that's a pretty significant number. Yeah. But then the Moremen family brings 23 with them.
All right, so we're in the house.
So we're in the house.
Where are we going next?
And of course, being right on the river, you would assume that it's been flooded. But there's only once we actually know of water being in the house, and that was in 1937. Okay. That was the Great Flood of 1937. And you can actually YouTube, there's newsreel footage from the 37 flood. It was the largest natural disaster in Louisville history. 250,000 people had to be evacuated. And the Red Cross was here for about 6 months, helping the city rehabilitate. It was huge. It was
Goodness
huge.
Gracious.
But this is our high water mark from the 37 flood.
You got to...
That's actually mud embedded in the plaster. So that was really...
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Yeah. The last bout of flooding we had.
And real quick, you all see the water. Well, hopefully you're able to see the water is further out there. And she's saying that it got up to here. That's wow. Goodness.
I know. It's pretty crazy. So when, we were talking about enslaved people being hired out, and we were fortunate enough to have Michael Twitty in town back in 2019, and he did a workshop. And one of the things he said was that enslaved people were brought here empty-handed, but not empty-headed. And that's always stuck with me, because we talk about their labor all the time, but we don't talk about their knowledge and their skill. And this is actually one of the original features of the house, is this doorstop, minus the spider.
Minus the spider that's occupying it. I've never seen a doorstop
and
like this.
I hear that all the time. And for the longest time, we called that a shaker-style doorstop, but we can't find any evidence to support that.
Yeah.
So and although it's pretty calm today, we usually have a breeze, and so it was, the house was built to take advantage of that. But oh gosh, that door slams shut, and it's so loud. But yeah, just creative problem solving that came out of the mind of one of the workmen.
Yeah.
I'm gonna slide this shut.
Okay.
So Farnsley was a bachelor. He actually lives in this house. He never gets married. He never has any children. Definitely seemed to like to go down to Louisville and take advantage of the distractions that were available there. But he lives in the house for about 12 years before he gets sick suddenly. And he is taken to his brother Alex, who his farm not too far from here. And he's treated for malaria. And I actually have seen historic maps that just say malaria along the stretch of the river. But who knows, maybe it was kind of the tail end of a cholera epidemic, maybe in a time before penicillin, that bachelor lifestyle caught up with him.
Yeah.
But he dies in 1849 without a will. And that immediately somebody comes in and creates an estate inventory. And that is the primary source of evidence that we have used to purchase period pieces that would have been available here in Kentucky. Nothing belonged to him, because by 1850, there's actually an auction, and we have John Crittenden is the grand marshal of that sale, and he actually keeps records. And that estate inventory and those records are really important, because those are the only places that we know the names and ages of the people he enslaved. So, but yeah, if you notice things like the map and the clock and the books, those are all luxury items, but there's nothing here that's just for decoration. So, but because this was a commercial operation, we believe that his bedroom was downstairs and the rooms upstairs were being rented out. So.
Now, what about his brother? You said there was another.
Yeah, so his older brother built a farm very similar to this, and it's actually still that the house is still there. You can still see it. It's owned by the local school system. It's right next to a middle school. And that's super interesting, because in a couple of years after Gabriel and his business partner purchased this property, his brother dies. And you see his business partner sell his shares to Gabriel, and then he marries his widowed sister-in-law and lives in that house. But he was a builder. Recently, I figured out that he was a builder.
Okay.
And the brick portion of that house, the Farnsley-Moremen house, is identical to this, and that's significant. So it looks like he was the one who came up with the plans.
Okay. And speaking of bricks, there's some exposed brick.
We
right
do,
here.
And that's not from the flood. We had a roof leak, but my favorite question to ask is, how did they do that? And it's really fascinating. You can see all the plaster work, but the inside and outside walls of the house are brick. So
Gotcha.
Outside walls are 5 bricks thick, and the inside walls are 3 bricks thick. So about 300,000 bricks.
My God. And these doors are huge.
They are huge.
And tall.
Well, and it's all ventilation and
Yeah. Got to be smart about it, that's for sure.
and making the house easier to heat and cool. It's super fascinating. And people ask all the time, what is the most valuable thing that we find in the archaeology? So really helping people understand that it's about filling in those missing pieces, right? And what's really valuable is something that gives you information you didn't have before. This is an original Farnsley family piece. This belonged to Gabriel's brother, Alex. It was made by an itinerant carpenter here in this area in the 1840s. It's an interesting piece.
Nice. Yeah, it is interesting.
And one of the things I try, when we're connecting the dots and connecting the pieces, is local examples of these national phenomenon, and you really see that here. And we were talking about trauma earlier, and the trauma of enslavement, and it's. For a long time, the narrative in Kentucky was slavery wasn't that bad here. And so I think as a response to that, historic sites have tried to be like, yes, it really is that bad. And it doesn't necessarily, it's not as effective as they wanted it to be, but I think connecting it to the way that families were separated, and that constant uncertainty and that disconnection. And we have direct evidence of that. We see there's 1, if not 2 family groups that are split up in the sale after Gabriel's death. And I think that has been much more effective. It's really interesting, because we're always trying to cultivate empathy, but that process in and of itself, in order to do that, you have to rehumanize people.
This is true.
And that's what we're trying to do. So.
This is true.
Gabriel's the 7th of 9 kids, and when he dies, he leaves no will. So pretty much immediately, they start a lawsuit, and that the estate is under contention for about 10 years. And that 10-year period is, we have records of the families that lived here. Several families come and lease the property. A couple of them think they buy it. They get involved in this lawsuit that ends up having 21 different litigants, and it lasts for over a decade.
Wow.
But that is one of those missing pieces of the puzzle. And so what I would like to do is do some more research and find out, how many people were enslaved here, because they wouldn't have been running a farm without them. And so just because even, how can you talk about people if you don't even have names?
This is true.
And so it's you can't humanize people without their names.
This is true. Were there any battles that were near here?
There were few. Well, Brandenburg was actually much more kind of centered. But then Fort Duffield isn't very far from here, and that was a Civil War site. But Kentucky, even as a slave state, they don't leave the Confederacy. And so at one point you have like Union and Confederate recruiters in downtown.
Oh, wow.
And so Kentucky is this transition zone between North and South and East and West, but it is also a place of severe contradictions. So we had raids and that sort of thing, and the soldiers were close, but not any major battles close to Louisville.
Okay.
So
I see a lot of carpet in this house.
yes.
Obviously, it's not original.
It's not, but the lady who does it is actually nationally known. Her name is Rabbit Goody, and like the carpet downstairs, that's the first time that 1840s pattern has been reproduced for any house in the United States.
Okay.
Like these are all historic patterns, and they're all hand reproduced, and
that's amazing. So when you said that you think that he lived downstairs and perhaps these rooms were boarding homes? I mean, boarding spaces for people?
He was renting these rooms out.
Okay.
Because besides the steamboats, you had all sorts of smaller flatboats that were making the trip to New Orleans.
Yeah.
So this is Rachel Nalonson, and her maiden name is Stith. At one point, one of her great-grandfathers is the president of William and Mary College. They seem to be Quakers that come here from Virginia.
Wow.
But yeah, they weren't hick farmers. They were both literate and educated, and really valued education as well. But yeah, so they move here in 1860, and then in 1862 is when they purchase it. And that's the same year that the government passes the Homestead Act. And I think what it does is it drives down land prices everywhere else, and they just start gobbling up land.
Yeah. And
then a son gets married, and they stick him on a piece of land, and they keep doing that until 1885, and they're down to one son left at home. They've got a 30-year-old son still living at home.
Yeah.
But like I said, that slave schedule that they wrote when they left Brandenburg didn't have anybody's name on it. So this was one of the photographs that we had. And
this is in 1907. Family reunion.
And it's just, those threads and that whole process and the way it all becomes connected. And so Richard applies for his pension, and he actually passes away before he gets it. And so Kitty applies for her widow's pension, and the main question for any woman who was applying for a widow's pension was whether or not she could prove she was legally married to the soldier.
Exactly.
And that's particularly difficult for enslaved women. But we have an affidavit written by a couple, Sidney Bell and her husband, the Alexanders. And apparently they were witnesses at Richard and Kitty's wedding.
Okay.
And they were married by a Black Methodist minister. And so they were able to get the pension. But even more important, we have names, right? We have the Alexanders. Yeah, and you start following that trail, and come to find out the Alexanders have 5 children, and the youngest 3 are girls. And all 3 of those girls would end up becoming teachers in the Louisville segregated public school system. In fact, their middle daughter, Emma, was born enslaved here in 1864, and she becomes the first valedictorian of what we know today as Central High School.
That family reunion picture with the white Mormons, that was in 1907. Kitty passed in 1921.
Yep.
So was she still living on the property?
She was
living
not actually.
elsewhere?
She lived in a little house downtown in downtown Louisville.
Okay.
But she did seem to maintain, the connection with the family, and it's very possible that they were related. The evidence certainly does support, that. And I'm really grateful, even though we have not made contact with any of Richard and Kitty's genetic descendants, at least the Moremen family and the living descendants they understand, there's not a lot of resistance. They're actually really grateful for the work that we do and the way that we tell that story.
That's good. That's good. So this is the view.
This is the view.
Wow.
This is such a strange place. This is where I first realized that people project themselves into the past. And some of the ways that happens is really interesting.
Very much so.
But this was the children's room. All four of the kids, they had 3 girls and a boy, stayed in this room. And because the Moremen family lived here for so long and we have such a close relationship with them, a lot more of what you see up here, it actually belonged to them.
Right, so they just were passing things down.
Yeah, in fact, this wardrobe on the back of this top rail still has a delivery tag on it.
Oh, wow. Valley, is that Valley?
Valley Station, yeah.
Valley Station, Kentucky.
That's what this area was.
So we know that this is
germane
to the site.
It belonged to the Moremen family. And what it looks like is when they get married and they buy a set of furniture.
Yeah.
So, and then as we go down the stairs, it's got the original box lock on it, but it originally only locked from the outside.
What?
Yeah.
It's weird.
It is weird. And
so should we
you can go down there. But what it really looks like is, hotels. In fact, the Galt House has cells in the basement because that was an amenity that they could offer to travelers. They could actually charge them extra to lock up the enslaved people that they had just purchased. Because, of course, that's when people are willing to take really severe risks, right? And here you can see the doors actually modified
I do see that.
later on to be accessible from the inside.
Yeah.
But it originally...
Yeah.
And so what it was potentially was, because if you were running a hotel and you didn't have something like that, you'd a lot of times have an agreement with the local jailer to secure people. But you didn't have that here.
Yeah.
So I think this was, and we have family records of children staying in what they nicely call it the inward room at the Farnsley-Moremen house.
The other one is at the room.
So that was what the family called that room. And so my guess is that my theory is that this was an amenity. He could actually charge extra.
Yeah.
This is the first building we found doing the archaeology, and they spent about 3 years excavating it. None of our excavation actually goes on without the public. They are involved in every part of it, whether it's our field trip program or public events. But they found so much information that they're pretty sure this is as close as we can get. They found about 30,000 nails.
Goodness gracious.
Which were an important artifact because not only did it tell you how things were built, but
would they be made on site as well?
Not that we can tell, potentially, but what we do have is we have a documented chronology of nail making, and so those helped us date the building. And so we have here. Let me wipe the dust off. So you had nails, and then we were finding things like animal bones and pieces of food storage crock, which allowed us to understand what the building was being used for. But we put the door where we found the doorknob. We put the windows where we found the concentrations of window glass. We found the foundation for the hearth and the pit cellar. And pit cellars are a feature of African buildings, as are shotgun houses. So the original design for shotgun houses comes in through the French sugar making colonies, but we've got a direct connection to New Orleans. A lot of the ironwork that New Orleans is so famous for was actually made here in Louisville and shipped down the river.
Wow.
I was in New Orleans not too long ago. And I grew up in Houston, and New Orleans feels like a cross between Houston and Louisville to me. But then we started finding domestic artifacts. We have this. This is the neck of a glass bottle. This is the end of a clay smoking pipe, and so the lead shot was an interesting. Sometimes the piece is there and kind of where it goes in the puzzle, but it doesn't quite fit because we know enslaved people weren't allowed to own guns.
Sure.
But we also know that they were supplementing their diets, right?
And some would be able to utilize guns to hunt for the family.
Yes, for the family. And this area wasn't early on. It was considered relatively unsafe because of Native American activity.
Yeah.
And so maybe, but then I was talking to an older gentleman. He's actually one of the workmen who does some of the restoration carpentry at Oxmoor. And he was talking about when his dad taught him to hunt with a slingshot when he was a kid. And he said marbles were what he used when he was target practicing. But when he was really trying to take something down, he used lead shot. Because we thought maybe it was a fishing weight, that sort of thing. But it's still a little light for a fishing weight. And so, but that's a possibility too.
Yeah.
But then people always ask, they're like, what's the coolest thing you find? And this spoon handle is one of the coolest things we find. That's the actual spoon handle. If you want a better picture, there's one on the sign. But if you can see, there's this X that's etched into that.
Yep, I see it right there.
Have you heard about the X-marked artifacts?
The only X mark that I know is Malcolm X.
So archaeologists actually have found these X-marked artifacts. A lot of times they're actually coins that are pierced and that can be worn. Early on in the colonial era, they were actually on the bottom of dishes made by enslaved people. But and they have found these artifacts from New York all the way to Texas from the colonial era. We have evidence of some of these practices well into the 1960s.
Wow.
And at first they were like, okay, we definitely know that this is a symbol of identity and community. But then through more research and talking to modern day practitioners of actual indigenous religions and things like that, we realized that X is actually a really important symbol that comes from West Africa. And it is the center of a cosmogram, and it's actually an equilateral cross.
Wow. And
originally it's supposed to, like the vertical line represents the line that connects the spiritual and the physical world. And then the horizontal line is the line that separates the two, which is seen as water. And so, of course, we are not sure how much of that belief system gets passed down. But what it is we see these beliefs, and we find these artifacts a lot of times with like blue beads and pieces of mirror and in certain locations. And what it shows us is that people brought their beliefs with them, and they merged them and were able to pass those down,
even in secrecy.
Even in secrecy, right?
Which for in their cases, most of it was that.
And, the author Dana Ramey Berry talks about the way enslaved people cultivated soul value, that independent way of valuing yourself that had nothing to do with the system that commodified you. And, we have these really obvious expressions like Richard, but for me, these represent a much more subtle expression of that and just ways that people stay connected.
Sure.
And, but it also shows, every culture.
But it's also an act of resistance as well.
It is an act of resistance. It's pushing back. It's saying I'm a person and I'm important and I matter. And I think that's one of the important things that we convey, the idea that nobody let themselves be a slave, that whether or not we recognize it or not, that people were resisting that process. And we have found these X-marked artifacts. They found them here at Riverside. They found them at Locust Grove, which is another Louisville site. They found them at Farmington, which is another Louisville site. They found an X-marked pierced coin at the site in Brandenburg, the Mormon family site in Brandenburg. And a lot of times the coins are actually Liberty half dimes.
Okay.
And so you've got the winged Liberty imagery of it. But I was down in New Orleans and I was talking to somebody and they said a lot of times silver is also considered protective because it tarnishes in contact with a lot of the components of hexing powders.
Mm.
But we have pictures of people wearing dimes to prevent headaches, like well into the 1960s.
So obviously, Kitty would be here. What are some of the other names that we know of?
So one woman, and Alonson, turns out before he left Brandenburg, there were about 53 people enslaved at Glen Font, which was their plantation in Brandenburg. It looks like he's holding some people in trust for his children. But before they move here, apparently Aunt Amy was the matriarch of the enslaved community, and she was Lonson's former mammy. And she was very upset about the separation of the family that was going to take place, and passed away. But she's actually buried in the Moremen family cemetery. She's got a headstone not 20 feet from him and Rachel.
What was the death notice in the newspaper about her?
It didn't say in the newspaper. It's part of the family kind of lore, and her headstone says, it just says Old Aunt Amy.
Yeah.
And it's really, we talk about the complexity in relationships, and I try and put myself in people's shoes, right? Because if that's when you're really successful, when you know enough about them to kind of be able to view the world through their perspective. And I think about these experiences that were just ubiquitous for women. No matter what your color, you were going to lose at least one of your children.
Yes, it's
and I was talking about it with the lady on a tour, and she said, "Oh my gosh, I asked my great grandmother about this, and I'm telling you, this conversation has haunted me." Because she asked her, she said, "Granny, what do you do? How did you deal with that?" And she said, "You just don't love them until you know they're gonna live."
The kids.
The kids.
Damn.
Right, like exactly.
But I get it.
But yes, it's a defense mechanism, right? But then you start thinking about what is that? How does that impact you, right? How does that impact? First of all, how do you do that? But then what does that do to your ability to bond to your child? And what does that do to the child, right? And then you think about that emotional distance. And then that child is actually nursed and cared for by somebody they eventually own.
Yeah.
Like, what does that do to you, right?
Yep.
And it shows how complex things can be. But then you also think of, enslaved women. Imagine having 10 children and never being with your children, right? You lose all of them because they're taken from you. And I think we have to start. There's enough blame to go around for the past, but nobody alive today is to blame for any of that. But we have a collective responsibility to understand the impact of it, and to do what we can to repair that damage and not do any more damage, right?
That's the key piece. Not doing any more damage.
And it's not as hard as people think it is. But it's possible. And these places, especially right after we have the fire at Nottoway, there's this conversation about these places and how we do this work. And I think the relevance, if we do not make these places where we can explore our collective history, then they lose their relevance. And you can't profit off this idealized version of the past and expect it to be a sustainable model. Let's just put it that way.
So this is the river.
That's the river.
Right here. A lot of money made off this river. And how far up do we have to go before we get to Indiana on this river? So it's right. So it's
Indiana's right there.
Okay, so
that's it. That's Indiana, and the river is about a mile wide at downtown, but it's narrower here.
Okay.
Thank you so much for visiting. This is Riverside, the Farnsley-Moremen Landing, and we are in Southwest Jefferson County. This site, it's really shows the power of place and the power of geography and why it's important to remember who we are and where we come from, and be able to connect with the places from the past. And so I invite everybody to visit.
Yes.
Riversidelanding.org is our website, but we're on social medias as Riverside, the Farnsley-Moremen Landing. But we appreciate your visit today.
No problem, no problem. And like I always tell you all, if you like this type of content, please make sure to subscribe and share. Peace and blessings.